During a brief ceasefire, Reedy, one of the Irish soldiers, is unexpectedly hit in his right hip. He painfully screams and falls to the ground. Sergeant Pendergast, in the distance, hastily carries him as the enemies continue to open fire on their position. The movie begins with Congolese Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba despondently sitting in the back seat of a moving vehicle. Then, he surprisingly hears the yell of riots and unexpectedly sees a vehicle in front of them explode. His car door is opened, and soldiers forcefully drag him. In an abandoned room, he is a bloody captive and sees General Moise Tshombe right in front of him. He frighteningly says his last words then, in an instant, a bullet is fired at his head. One morning, Dr. Conor Cruz O'Brien, an Irish man and head of the United Nations Congo Division, is giving his speech in a conference room of the United Nations. He proudly addresses the duty of Irish soldiers to serve as UN peacekeepers in Jadotville, Congo, after the assassination of the country's prime minister. Sometime later at night, in a local pub, Commandant Pat Quinlan is having a drink together with other Irish soldiers. Aware of the mission, he is mentally prepared to take the challenge despite not knowing what to expect in Jadotville, Congo. After a while in a military infirmary, the group of new recruit Irish soldiers is painfully receiving their bicillin shot in their buttocks one by one. Little later, on a sunny morning, the group of Irish soldiers is bidding farewell to their families and loved ones. Minutes later, Commandant Quinlan authoritatively discusses the mission with them before deployment. Not long after, General Moise Tshombe arrogantly speaks to the press regarding welcoming Irish soldiers to Congo. He confusingly questions their agenda in the country. Nonetheless, he pledges to be a thoughtful host to them. Meanwhile, Dag Hammarskjöld, Secretary General of the United Nations, firmly assigns Dr. O'Brien on a mission to put an end to General Tshombe's antics. Accordingly, Dr. O'Brien confidently accepts to lead the UN peacekeeping mission in Congo. On the contrary, General Tshombe speaks on the telephone with General Charles de Gaulle to seek assistance against the Irish soldiers. In exchange, he promised that the French mining companies in Congo would continue to operate. Convinced, General de Gaulle immediately assures to send 1,000 of his men. Meanwhile, in the UN compound near Jadotville, the Irish soldiers arrived. They thoroughly examine the area and immediately report to Commandant Quillan. Later on, Commandant Quillan commands his men to dig trenches tomorrow morning. The next day, the Irish soldiers are cheerily digging trenches when suddenly, they notice an African soldier spying on them from afar. Sometime later, Sergeant Jack Prendergast informs Commandant Quillan of the shortage in their ordnance and food supplies. Devastatingly, Commandant Quillan and some of his men immediately drive to a nearby local store to gather some supplies. Minutes later, Commandant Quillan encounters a middle-aged woman named Madame Laffongaine, who politely tells him that people residing in Congo are not happy with their arrival. After a while, Commandant Quillan and 2 of his men walk to a local pub nearby. As they enter, the atmosphere becomes silent when people begin to judgingly stare at them. René Fawkes, a French mercenary hired by the mining companies allied with Tshombe's government, invites Commandant Quinlan for a drink. Then, they ask for each other's agenda. Commandant Quillan mentions protecting the locals, whereas Fawkes is ordered to protect the interests of the mines. Afterward, they start to provoke each other's capability and nationality. As they part ways, Commandant Quillan heads to a local resident's house nearby. As he knocks on the doorstep, he coincidentally encounters Madame Laffongaine from the local store. He convincingly asks to borrow her telephone to make a personal call to his wife left in Ireland. After the short call, Madame Laffongaine enlightens him of Jadotville containing the world's richest uranium deposits. Instantly, Commandant Quillan grows suspicious of the French mercenaries he met a while ago. Later that day, Commandant Quillan and his men drive back to the UN compound. Commandant Quillan orders Sergeant Prendergast to inform General McEntee about the French mercenaries and mining operations in Jadotville. Subsequently, Sergeant Prendergast hastily drives to one of the UN bases. He encounters General McEntee together with Dr. O'Brien. He swiftly conveys the message to them, but Dr. O'Brien believes Commandant Quillan is just overreacting. Dr. O'Brien undoubtedly thinks that the French mercenaries will attack the UN compound. Afterward, Sergeant Prendergast annoyingly leaves. Meanwhile, in Operation Morthor, Dr. O'Brien orders UN soldiers to launch an attack against government buildings held by the Congolese in Elizabethville. One chaotic morning at Katanga radio station, Dr. O'Brien unexpectedly receives news about the 30 unarmed Congolese radio operators and employees accidentally executed by UN soldiers. Dr. O'Brien frustratingly orders Desmond to make the incident hidden from the UN dispatches. In retaliation, Fawkes receives orders to attack Shadatville. Congolese forces and mercenaries under Fawkes' command attack and besiege the unprepared Irish soldiers. Sometime later, Bill Reddy, a UN Irish sniper, is on a lookout above their UN compound. Suddenly, he screams out the other Irish soldiers as he magnifies enemies with his rifle, moving closer from a far distance. Meanwhile, Irish soldiers are preoccupied as they are attending a mass indoors. Suddenly, they hear a loud gunshot. They hastily grab their weapon and spread around the compound. During a brief ceasefire, Reedy, one of the Irish soldiers, is unexpectedly hit in his right hip. He painfully screams and falls to the ground. Sergeant Pendergast, in the distance, hastily carries him as the enemies continue to open fire on their position. Minutes later, enemies are decreasing in number. Fawkes unanticipatedly orders retreat. They swiftly move away, the Irish soldiers shakingly cease fire. After a while, the compound is surrounded by dead bodies of injured enemies. The Irish soldiers remain alert for the next attack. Fawkes plans to multiply his troops at the enemy's base to outnumber the Irish soldiers. He demands his troops win and finish the next attack in one go. On the other hand, Commandant Callan plans their positioning for the next attack. Sergeant Pendergast sadly informs him of the little ammunition left on their supplies. After that, Commandant Callan receives a call from General McEntee. He begs for reinforcement. Dr. O'Brien then arrives to grab the telephone from General McEntee. He answers Commandant Quillen's call and frustratingly demands him to remain calm. Commandant Callan is strongly persuading him for assistance. However, he cannot provide reinforcement as all their forces deal with the Katanga radio station incident. Meanwhile, General Chambe is arrogantly addressing the press about the incident in Elizabethville. He believes that UN peacekeepers turned to aggressors. As Dr. O'Brien watches him from the news, he frustratingly orders Desmond to make it possible to privately see General Chambe. One cloudy morning in the UN compound, the Irish soldiers spread their position while on a lookout. Commandant Callan views the enemies through his binoculars when suddenly, he screamingly alerts his men to commence the attack. During the open fire, Commandant Callan orders Bill Reddy to shoot the man in a white suit standing near the enemies. He assumes he has the upper hand over them. In one shot, the man in a white suit falls dead immediately. After that, Fawkes screamingly orders a retreat. Then, he raises a white flag as he moves closer to the UN compound alone. Later on, Commandant Callan walks towards him as he holds a long branch with a white handkerchief. As they stand face to face in the field near the UN compound, Fawkes vainly demands Commandant Quillen's surrender. Commandant Callan confidently responds to never capitulate even if the enemies continue to open fire multiple times. Fawkes frustratingly leaves. Minutes later, emergency vehicles briefly park on the field to carry injured people. Some of the enemies unnoticeably hide in the tall grass. As the emergency vehicles depart, Hegarty, one of the Irish soldiers, suddenly notices a trap on the field and screamingly alerts his comrades. Unexpectedly, the enemies bombarded the UN compound. They repeatedly strike mortar ammunition in the area. In response, the Irish soldiers open fire and strike mortar ammunition at the enemy's position. Afterward, the enemies open fires as they move closer to the compound and retreat again minutes later. After a while, Secretary General Hammarskjöld finds out about the Katanga radio station incident. He desires Dr. O'Brien to owe the blame instead of hiding the incident from the UN dispatchers. Sometime later at night, Dr. O'Brien and General Chambe meet outside a hangar. General Chambe mentions hearing rumors about the assassination of his Katangese loyalist. Dr. O'Brien vehemently denies the accusation. General Chambe continuously pressures Dr. O'Brien to make the UN resolution recognize him as president of Katanga and its legitimate government. Confused, Dr. O'Brien believes it's not possible. Meanwhile, Commandant Callan requests again for reinforcement from General McEntee. General McEntee promises to send reinforcement tomorrow morning. In a split second, the enemies bombarded the UN compound. The structures in the compound light on fire. Consequently, the Irish soldiers hastily save their ordnance left before everything turns into ash. One morning in the United Nations conference room, Secretary General Hammarskjöld is being questioned for mishandling the mission in Katanga. He briefly responds to the accusations and leaves immediately. In the interval, the Irish soldiers in the UN compound had little supplies left to survive. With water being poisoned by the enemies and a shortage in ordnance, the Irish soldiers have zero option but to wait for reinforcement. Subsequently, General Mackendy contacts Commandant Callan. He notifies him of the current reported situation of reinforcements in the bridge near the UN compound. Sadly, the support is cornered and outnumbered. As a result, they retreat and fail to assist the Irish soldiers at the UN compound. Frustrated, Commandant Callan forcefully asks for orders from General Mackendy. General Mackendy, hesitant to speak, commands Quinlan to carry out orders despite knowing they lack the ordnance to defend themselves. After that, the Irish soldiers continue to open fire as the enemies ruthlessly attack them. Then, moments later, the enemies retreat again, leaving the Irish soldiers dazed and confused. Momentarily, a fighter jet shoots down missiles in the UN compound. Some Irish soldiers fall to the ground and end up ultimately wounded. Meanwhile, Commandant Callan and the rest remain standing. In despair, Commandant Callan miserably sees his men suffering. The military medic notifies him of a shortage of supplies, and the injured soldiers may fall dead anytime soon. Minutes later, as Commandant Callan is dismayingly walking, an enemy sniper shoots him in the chest, making him fall to the ground. Immediately, the Irish soldiers rush to carry him. The military medic hastily gathers his medical apparatus. He carefully removes the bullet from the commandant's chest. He instantly dresses the wound due to lack of supply for sanitation. Sometime later, in a plane, Secretary General Hammarskjöld departs for Congo to meet General Chambe. On the telephone, he argues with Dr. O'Brien about the Katanga radio station incident when suddenly, an unidentified aircraft swiftly follows his plane. Meanwhile, a fighter jet rapidly shoots the UN Army flight medic on the way to the UN compound. After that, Commandant Callan hastily uses Vickers' machine gun to continuously shoot at the fighter jet. Instantly, he commands his men to flip the vehicle where the Vickers machine gun is attached. He lies on his back as he promptly waits for the fighter jet to pass. He constantly shoots the fighter jet, and it speedily moves away. In the interval, Dr. O'Brien cowardly convinces General Mackendy to leave the Irish soldiers on their own as he does not want to be held responsible if it leads to full-out war. Then, suddenly, Desmond arrives in his office to sadly inform the passing of Secretary General Hammarskjöld in a plane crash on the way to Congo. Dr. O'Brien is shockingly out of words. Meanwhile, the Irish soldiers carry their injured comrades to the UN Army flight medic. As the UN Army flight medic is about to depart, one of the enemies, from a distance, aims his bazooka at it and swiftly shoots. About to crash, the injured soldiers accidentally fall meters above the ground. Luckily, they manage to survive as Commandant Callan and the others hastily carry them right before their body gets crashed. Later that day, the Irish soldiers requested assistance again from General Mackendy. They are in despair as they are forced to fight and survive independently. In a split second, the enemies return again but with a more significant number. With no bullets left, Commandant Callan orders his men to quickly gather all the shells on the ground. In addition, he commands them to set up explosive devices before the enemies get closer. Prepared, the Irish soldiers await the enemies coming. As the enemies are close, Commandant Callan orders to activate the bomb. The bomb explodes, and numerous bloody bodies lay on the ground. Meanwhile, the Irish soldiers unhesitatingly grab the dead enemies' rifles. As the shooting continues, the number of enemies continues to increase in number. In contrast, the number of Irish soldiers remains the same. Unceasingly, the Irish soldiers continue to fight back. The UN compound is heavily bombarded as the enemies persist in shooting missiles and mortar ammunition. As the atmosphere becomes silent, the Irish soldiers confusingly cease fire due to the fog around the compound. Unhesitatingly, Commandant Callan courageously stands up and moves closer to the enemy's location unarmed. As he comes closer, Fawkes angrily points his gun at him as they stand face to face like last time. Speechless, Commandant Kalan surrenders and seals a deal with Fawkes through a handshake. They both part ways. Minutes later, Commandant Kalan unhappily asks his men, "Should we surrender?" They unhesitatingly respond, "No," as they are determined to fight back until the end. Commandant Kalan is proud of their response. However, he already decides to end the war against the mercenaries. After numerous attack waves, the Irish soldiers failed to carry out the mission to protect Jadotville due to a shortage of ordnance and most certainly because of no assistance sent to them. Days later, Irish soldiers are held captive in Katanga prison for a month awaiting their deaths. Then, luckily, word came that they were to be sent back to Ireland. One morning, the Irish soldiers landed in Ireland. As they walk by, Commandant Kalan is blandly welcomed by General Mackendy. However, he learns that all their hard work will be hidden from the public for a couple of days in Jadotville, Congo. After that, he angrily punches General Mackendy as he provokingly threatens to send him and the others to court-martial for cowardice. The movie ends when the Irish soldiers proudly stand and salute Commandant Kalan. Commandant Kalan smiles as he leaves to see his wife waiting for his return.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more videos like this to help the channel out. Have a nice day.